GVM to be welcoming Professor Jeffrey Sharkey. Together with us today, Professor Jeffrey is now the principal of the Royal Conservatory of Scotland, and he's now is one of the schools that is most known for most innovative ideas of how to make music studies more interesting and more fascinating and currently up to date for today. Professor Sharkey is a pianist and a composer. He was previously a director of Johns Hopkins University Peabody Institute and the Dean of Cleveland Institute of Music, and he's now still very much active and doing master classes for different things at the moment. So today his talk will be talking about divergent learning for musicians, how collaborative learning with other performing arts can help musicians develop distinctive personalities and enhance the art. So if I could introduce Professor Jeffrey Sharkey and welcome him on stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anatai. And as previous speakers were mentioning, this is, for me, my second visit to this wonderful institution. And even in 1 year, I've seen so much growth. And what's special for me is there's a little bit of Scottish DNA in this very institution, because both you and JB studied with Professor Nigel Osborne in Edinburgh, and there's an element that I can actually see echoed here. And the other thing Anatai I've been talking with you about, is how there's the Western tradition, but there's also an internal tradition here, wonderful Thai traditional music, and we have Scottish traditional music, and that is certainly one of the ways we've tried to grow more divergent as well as through other performing arts. So there are similarities in our potential journeys that I hope I can share with you today. I'm going to start by talking about the old way. This is a picture of our original Conservatoire building. We were founded in 1847, and you can see this fancy hall on the screen with a balcony for the director, who was usually an old man with a beard, that sat presiding and inspiring as much fear as possible in every examination. This building still exists in Glasgow. We no longer work there. We moved in 1989. But oddly enough, it's now the best Thai restaurant in Glasgow. And this is the main dining room, and it's named after the river right here in Bangkok. So early conservatoires, including our own RCS, were founded on a traditional model of the master and apprentice. Not a bit of static here. Can you hear me? And originally, these were teachers who were not affiliated with any institution. Teachers of the piano like Lesachitsky and Liszt. And they had great classes. They taught their students. Lesachitsky went on to be one of the founding faculty members of the St. Petersburg Conservatoire. And our early conservatoires, including in Scotland, built on that model with one-to-one teaching as a core, developing ear training skills, developing supporting studies in musicianship. And that one-to-one teaching today still remains an incredibly effective way of educating a student. It's a concentrated kind of learning where you're going to learn through the eyes of that master teacher about the art, about the sense of line, about the sense of technique, the sense of tradition. But it comes with a danger. It comes with a danger that the individual personality of the young student can sometimes be subsumed into that of the master teacher. And indeed, there are some teachers that had a career, a wonderful career, but in an age different from the one that there is now. And they may not be as aware of what's going on in the world. And this is one of the reasons in Scotland we started thinking about how can we get divergent approaches to the teaching of young people. Our other art forms existed at a pretty early time, and they are almost always taught in an ensemble. So it's an acting troupe, a dance corps. They learn as much from one another in the act of learning and in the act of practicing as they do from the influence of the teachers around them. And it's something that, if we're not careful, musicians can miss out on. I call this slide separation because it's also our past. when the big Stevenson Hall was created in around 1847. Soon after that, right next to it, we developed a theater called the Athenaeum. It was a beautiful theater. It's now a hard rock cafe. I don't know how that happened. But you'll see in the other picture, there was definitely separation. There's even a line. It was called the Royal Scottish Academy of Music, and underneath a line, and College of Drama. And those students and those teachers came in a different door. They worked in completely different buildings. They mostly didn't know one another. I'm told they drank at different pubs. And there was absolutely no mixing. And I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity. So some years ago, we began to question, how can musicians gain more agency? That's a word I think a lot of us like, agency, the ability to control your own destiny, to control your own learning, to navigate your own artistic projects. The whole idea of being a producer, which I know some of the colleagues have talked about, that's a word that actors and dancers think about all the time. But in music, that was often devolved out to someone else that was the producer for the musician who practiced a lot. And getting the idea that production is also the part of the musician's life is something we can borrow from our other art forms. We also wanted to return to some of the original ideals of music and musicians. And it's been talked about here as well, how the art form is about communication between people on an incredibly deep and profound level. How the musician can be both a creator and a recreator. That's something we almost lost in the 20th century, where we put composers in one corner and performers in another corner, and we like to give labels to everyone. You're an uptown composer, you're a Baroque specialist. The idea of Debussy calling himself a musician is something we almost lost in the later part of the 20th century. We also wanted to give our students an appreciation and understanding also of the virtuosity of teaching, as well as the virtuosity of performance. Because if we can give them teaching skills so they can teach themselves, they can think of a new way to learn a phrase on their own, they also have an important skill that may well give them employment, and eventually they get this virtuous circle of what they learned in their teaching they put into their performing, and vice versa. So these were the sorts of conversations we began having to try to get away from this line, this old style of the master teacher and the apprentice musician. And we started, well, we were doing this for a while. Obviously, one thing that all conservatoires have is this idea of leading from any chair in chamber music. Chamber music, I think my colleague Bernard said the same thing, is one of the most profound ways of learning for a musician, because it's without a conductor telling you what to do. You may have the occasional coach, but each person has a role to play. Each person has a chance to lead from any chair, and equally importantly, to know when to give way. It's something actors do all the time. One of our acting teachers is fond of saying, the best thing you can do as an actor on stage is shine the light on someone else, not try to focus the attention on you, and in doing so, your character will evolve and develop. And we get that from chamber music. About 10 or 12 years ago, there was a big debate at the Conservatoire whether or not to start a degree in traditional music. So Scotland, like Thailand, like so many of the countries in Southeast Asia, has a deep, rich tradition of its own music. And we had a debate about values. There were those in the Scottish traditional music community that thought we would kill it by bringing it into an academic setting. There were those in the classical music community that thought about a watering down of standards or a different kind of technique, and would that just be another line that you had classical music here and you had traditional music there. And it's, again, something for this beautiful conservatoire to think about as you're planning on how to bring in, as you did so beautifully last night, traditional musics alongside Western classical. So we teach in the conservatoire, we teach the bagpipes. We have them practice in an underground bunker because they're very loud. We teach the clarsach, which is a beautiful lever harp, the accordion. We teach Gaelic singing and Scots singing. And we work on evolving that tradition. as a newcomer to Scotland, I've fallen in love with this tradition. I love the way that it's embraced and owned by everyone. So a composer may write a melody, may write some suggestions, but he gives it to the performers, or she gives it to the performers, and the performers decide, what is my take on this piece? There's a beautiful freedom from the page, where, in fact, they often don't have pages. It's a shared tradition, a shared method of knowing, again, like in the finest chamber music, when to give way for someone else, when to take the lead. So I'm just going to play a little example of Scottish traditional music. This is a wonderful singer who just graduated, Hannah, singing Smile or Cry. Sorry, I couldn't fade that out. Lovely melodies, and my own daughter is now going to school, and she's becoming Scottish. She can speak in slang, but what I love seeing her do, they all learn the tune. So they play in an orchestra, but they all learn the traditional melodies. They learn the steps. They can dance in a ceilidh. So it's an incredibly musical culture, and you must have the same thing here with young people growing up with such a beautiful tradition. And as Dieter said, we want to embrace it with humility, and learn how to work together. So we didn't want a line anymore. We've transformed this from an academic degree, which is what's its roots, to more of a performance degree. It's now a B.Mus in traditional music. And we changed it from Scottish to traditional because while Scottish will be at its core, we wanted to be welcoming of all traditions and all peoples. We have our first bagpiper from Hong Kong. We have many Irish. We have Scandinavian. We have our first Appalachian students from West Virginia coming over. And we also wanted to work out ways that our classical musicians could perform. And our brass players are really keen to do this, as are our jazz players. And it starts out as arrangements because the classical players are more used to reading notes, reading dots, but they quickly get the hang of it and start to improvise with a freedom. And here's an example of a collaboration between our traditional music, our brass, and our jazz students playing one of their jigs. have a whole album of that. It just makes you want to get up and dance, doesn't it? Next time I'll bring a Cayley band. So this is, to move to the next slide before I even knew it. I mentioned the virtuosity of teaching. And it's something I believe in passionately, that again, it's part of our humility that we should realize that we are students for life. We were talking last night how every piece, well, Bernard, you said it today, it's not just repertoire, it's a piece of music that's alive and breathing now, and you want to think about the performance that's unique and different because you're playing it and you're in the audience listening to it. And I think the art of teaching is really critical. And it's something that in Scotland, we've got to take some responsibility for. We're the National Conservatoire. About 70% of the teachers in Scotland are our graduates, and we're not very happy with the level of some instruments. It's not all our fault. Some of it's budget cuts. Local authorities just don't have the money they used to have. I'm told some 30 years ago in Scotland, you could always study for free in most places. They'd give you a cello. They'd give you a school would be a school that had viola, had cello, had violin, and they'd start everyone off, and there was a great generation of Scottish artists that grew up like that. That's disappeared. So we've decided to launch a program called Teach Arts for Scotland, where we are going to try to have two wins. A win for ourselves, which is that we will teach our students a love of pedagogy to go alongside a love of performing. And in doing so, we're going to place them in key places in the east, west, and north of Scotland and work to grow particularly young string players and young dancers. These are two areas of deficit in Scotland. And one of the loveliest things, our patron is His Royal Highness Prince Charles. And as a new principal, I had an hour-long meeting with him and talked about this dream of embedding pedagogy and to teach arts for Scotland. And he said, why don't you do it in my house? Which is his house, Dumfries House, right here. And I said, yes, Your Majesty, Your Highness. And he has a wonderful commitment already to young people. This is an Ayrshire, and while the house looks beautiful and posh, it was quite derelict before he restored it. And that area is a former mining community, and there are 3 or 4 generations of unemployed people. And he has started programs for sustainable farming, for engineering, for wardrobe making. Even the footmen and butlers and valets that he hires are all formerly unemployed people who might have been on the streets if he hadn't given them a chance to learn a new trade. So we are going to be his arts program, and it will be our West Coast area of starting this Teach Arts. We will train our undergraduates working with excellent pedagogues, and they will serve in assistantship positions in Dumfries House, in the East in Fife, where we're partnering with the community, and up in Aberdeenshire. So at least 3 places we're aiming to cover, while at the same time giving our students this important understanding of how they can teach themselves and be a student for life. I was reading, I think it was one of the books that came out of Edinburgh. Simon Frith was talking about 2 sides of creativity, and it was me that decided to put it in this table together. On the left-hand side are 3 examples that Simon talks about that seem good. I think we'd all agree that we respect originality and we want innovation in our arts, in our economies, and we like to celebrate difference. But he also talked about some perceived negatives in creativity, irrationality, unpredictability, and chaos. And the next part of my presentation, I want to talk about how at the RCS some 4 years ago, we decided to embrace this, the dangerous side, the side where students might fail. They might have a chance to do something and it might not work. And can we let that be the case, and can they learn from that failure? Can we do things that haven't been done before? Can we experiment and go further? So we created a course called Introduction to Collaborative Practice, and every student in year 1 is required to take this course, whether they like it or not. And we put musicians and dancers and actors and lighting designers all in a class together. And the first thing they have to learn is how to talk to one another. We have workshops on how to understand one another's language. What does a phrase mean to a musician? What does it mean to a dancer? How can a lighting designer accentuate that arc of a phrase? As a principal, one of the lucky things I get to do is dip into different things that happen in a day. And one day we had Chris Hampson, one of Scotland's most innovative choreographers, working with our dancers, and Richard Good giving a piano class. Great pianist, great Beethoven specialist. So Chris Hampson was working with the dancers and getting them to, I am not a dancer so I won't demonstrate, but getting them to stretch from their torso. Every single rib was the core of the beginning of the line that reached and tapered into the beautiful fingertips stretching over their head. But he said it all started from here, that underpinned everything. And then a few hours later, Richard Good was coaching a Beethoven sonata, one of our pianists, and he was talking about the quavers underneath that were underpinning the melody, the kind of engine driving the thing. And this was to me an example of two people speaking in their different languages, one a little bit more physical about the human body, but talking about the same thing, a phrase. So getting our students with humility to understand one another's art form and appreciate one another's art form is step one. Step two is we have them work on something together. The word devised really comes from the acting side of the house, I believe, and we get everyone to devise. We take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We ask them to pick a clause that is meaningful to them, and we form them into groups of 10 or 12, and they have to do a 10-minute devised piece of work that illustrates this clause from the Declaration of Human Rights. And that work can be free-flowing. It could be terrible. It could be moving. It could be exciting. It will often have elements of each of their art forms. For me, the biggest challenge has been getting our musicians to take a producer's eye to this and not an accompanist's eye to this. It has been a little too easy for them to say, tell me what to do, I'll play some nice things for you. I want them to be absolutely upfront in a way that the actors are perhaps a little more confident in doing that. But this lays the seeds for collaboration, and I believe it's transformed our music making and the way we think about music. We then build on this in choice modules, so you can take, if you're a musician, you can partner with an actor, you can partner with a production student and devise more of your curriculum. And it leads to interesting combinations and possibilities. So here's the first. Our pianists, I'm a pianist so I can say this, we're a lonely lot. We practice in a practice room alone. It's not until we get to play chamber music that we realize we need to keep time with someone else. It's not just our own personal rhythm. And every year our piano department has embraced the idea of working with dancers. They've taken The Rite of Spring for 4 hands. They've taken West Side Story. They've choreographed themselves. So it's wonderful to see our head of dance work with these clumsy pianists and try to get them to be a bit more graceful in the way that they approach the piano and the way that they change from 4-hand partners. And our dancers create their own choreography. I'm going to play a quick example. One of the other things our pianists are doing are working with Anto Pet from Estonia on atonal improvisation. And so they do some atonal improvisation while the dancers are improvising their own modern steps. And here's an example. Short. It was actually several departments. It was our dance department, our piano department, our electroacoustic department, and our lighting department, all improvising together. And it's been a transformative experience for each one of those art forms, but certainly for our pianists, having to think differently, having to watch what the dancers are doing, be inspired by it, or if they're playing West Side Story, to be in time with the dance steps, not just in time with themselves, and for the dancers maybe to dance more quickly than they thought they'd have to. So it's, again, a sharing that has broadened each one of the art forms. Every year, we have a contemporary music festival. We call it Plug. There are about 40 premieres in each one of these new music festivals. And this year, one of the pieces I was most taken with was written by a second-year student named Henry McPherson. And he wrote an opera. And anyone here that's a composer knows how frightening the thought, it shouldn't be frightening, the thought of writing an opera. I was with my teacher, John Corigliano, who was writing the first opera for the Metropolitan Opera since Samuel Barber's failed Antony and Cleopatra, and the pressure on him was enormous to deliver a successful opera. It wasn't fair. Anyway, back to this kid. He wrote a collaborative opera. He was inspired by his work in that first year course. He got to know different people in our different majors, and it's a shared composition. He had the musical ideas, but he worked with one of our film people who has a love of horror films, and worked to have him direct it to the music, worked with our opera department, managed to get the BBC's Scottish Symphony Orchestra to play in collaboration with our own musicians, and we got it filmed. And then we worked with our props department, and they love making things that bleed and, missing pieces of, Star Wars stuff. So I'm going to play the opening of it. It's a scary opera. So I hope I don't frighten you too much. It's daylight. But it's a really powerful thing. It's a 13-minute opera that this kid, who must be 19, wrote. And because of the collaboration, I think it took away some of that fear of writing my first opera, and also to open new lines of creativity. So here's a little bit of Ute. Scary stuff. Makes you never want to go to the dentist. Again, the fact that that so many art forms got involved, I think, created a new and innovative work. It was filmed on the set of River City, which is the cheesiest soap opera ever produced in Scotland. It's a set near Bear's Den. But because we have a partnership with the BBC through different art forms, they will give us the set for different projects like this several weeks in the year. So that's ready-made to be a community, to be a building, whatever, and our students can learn from that. And the fact that we filmed an opera there was a unique challenge for us, which leads me to the big thing I wanted to share. We wanted to celebrate like the world did Shakespeare last year, because it was the 400th anniversary of his death. Everyone was performing Shakespeare, and every year our acting department puts on 2, 3, or 4 different proper Shakespeare plays. But we wanted to celebrate in a collaborative way across our art forms that really celebrates what we've embedded in that year one collaborative idea. We wanted to celebrate cross institutions, and this is something I found so wonderful in Scotland, that people will say, well, let's give it a try. That's their first answer, rather than, well, what will it cost? So we started with our BBC partners, and we said we'd like to celebrate Shakespeare. Let's do something unique. And we also partnered with the Glasgow School of Art, a wonderful art school just up the road from us, and the University of Glasgow. And it began with 4 composers who were commissioned to write 15 minutes of orchestral music along themes of Midsummer Night's Dream. Our director of drama drew out the themes that he was going to use as a prompt for every participant in this. So they had these themes. The Glasgow School of Art had these themes, and they produced a whole design exhibition based on the same themes. And the composers wrote this music, and then 3 different art forms in Scotland were given a chance to respond to the same theme. So our acting, BA acting, took one of the compositions. We have the very first course for deaf actors. They had another chance to respond to this. And then our dancers had a chance to respond to this. We put it on in the University of Glasgow, and the BBC filmed it, and it became Scotland's contribution to the BBC celebration of Shakespeare for that year, because of all these ideas coming together. And you saw that table of risk and chaos. We hired Graham McLaren from the National Theatre of Scotland to be the artistic director, but until the day before, he couldn't tell us what it was going to look like, what it was going to be. So I had BBC executives ready to murder me if this was going to be a complete failure. We were taking a risk. So what you're going to see is not pure Shakespeare. It's inspired by Shakespeare. It's physical theatre, music behind it, but all from A Midsummer Night's Dream. I'll play you an excerpt.
Welcome to Glasgow University's stunning Bute Hall, where the commemorations and celebrations continue for Shakespeare 400. The curator of the project is the director Graham McLaren, and conducting members of the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra with students from the RCS is Michael Francis. Well, the orchestra, the director, the conductor, the performers, they're all in position. And we even have our own Glasgow groundlings here anticipating the performance. And if they thought they were going to have a po-faced, reverential approach to the bard's text and magical play, then they can dream on.
Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact.
that was an entire hour. I just played you obviously a little extract ending with that lovely Malarian thing, but an entire hour of work created by our students. It had very little faculty involvement except as guides, mentors, when asked. One of the biggest things we've learned in divergent education for musicians and all of our artists is sometimes it's best to get out of the way and just let them think for themselves, let them work together, and give ownership. And this is one of the slides you're seeing at the moment. We take a week in the year that's actually a holiday week in between the two terms, and we give the conservatoire to the students if they want it. They can go home or they can stay. And if they stay, they bid for a project. They have to put a proposal together. We encourage it to be multidisciplinary, but we don't insist upon it. If that bid gets through the selection, they get a hall, they get a budget, and they get a stage director. And we've had all manner of things. We've had brand new operas, a reinterpretation of Stravinsky's A Soldier's Tale, a brass quintet playing in a governed swimming pool, art in the community, art with film. They have to create the work, they have to market the work, they try to get an audience to it. Again, if it's good, we will give it more investment and allow it to continue to develop and take it then to the Edinburgh Festival. So giving students a chance to do things for themselves, think for themselves, is I think one of the most important things we can give our musicians. And I just wanted to finish on this note. As a conservatoire leader, I feel we have an obligation to develop a multiplicity of talents. We're all different shapes and sizes of conservatoire, and I accept that. But given every shape and size of conservatoire, if a student comes in and is seen as able to come in and seen as able to thrive and flourish, we want to find the different ways that they can thrive and flourish and celebrate that difference. And that's one of the things I love that we're doing in Scotland. So on the left-hand side, we have Petrica, who comes from Romania, and he's an absolutely glorious pianist. He wins international competitions, he plays on the BBC, concertos, dazzling showpieces. He's what you would consider to be a typical, wonderful product of a conservatoire, and we celebrate having him. But on the right, we also have Maria Donahue, who came to us from Brooklyn. And she's a fine pianist, but she just wasn't going to win an international competition. She wasn't that kind of pianist. And she took this introduction to collaborative practice to heart, and this became her raison d'etre. She decided to work all the time with other artists, and she developed a love of John Cage, and she partnered with this young lady in the back who is a dancer and a singer, and staged through Bridge Week this, I guess I call it a happening. It was an entire room devoted to I Ching and different elements of John Cage and performance art. And she takes us on the road. She's developing a name for that. And both are to be celebrated, both are to be nurtured. And our goal is that we would like to think we gave them each agency to survive and thrive and develop their own thinking. And that's something I hope all conservatoires can do. And thank you for having me here.